Shabbat Shalom. In the epistle to the Ephesians, the chapter 6 is the last chapter. And before, in the other chapters, Paul is writing to the Ephesians that it is wonderful that they had come to faith. They, as non-Jews, they were lucky, and their names are written down in heaven. They are elected, chosen, everything is wonderful. Then he explains to them how to live a good life, as well how to live in a family as a husband and wife, and the wife with a husband, and the parents with the children, so everything has to be in order. And then he explains everything to them, and then at the end, finally, in chapter 6, verse 10 in Ephesians, we read, verse 10, "Finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of His might. Put on the full armor of God so that you will be able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil." Then at the end he tells them, you have to resist or to stand firm against what the devil has planned against you. And in verse 12 he continues to explain to them, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places." Asking the question, are there some days in your life, there are in my life, where you ask yourself, what kind of a day is that? I'm not succeeding in anything today. Everything that can break, does break. And all of people who you can be in quarrel with, they are in quarrel. Those who were not able to quarrel, they had a sore throat. So it just didn't work. Are there some days in your life? Some of you do, some others not. So others, they had their sore throat. But there are these days. And where does this come from? Where does it come from? Where does it lead to? Paul is saying in the epistle to the Ephesians, everything that's happening in the world has a spiritual meaning, and you have to be ready for this moment. And he continues to explain to them how to be prepared. We read verse 14, the second part. We read verse 14 completely, but I'm interested in the second part. "Stand firm, therefore, having girded your loins with truth, and having put on the breastplate of righteousness." So the breastplate of righteousness. The expression sounds nice, good, but what does it mean for us? We know what a breastplate is. We have seen this in books, in movies, have heard about it. What is a breastplate? In Russian it sounds differently, and in German it is the breastplate. And everybody is talking about that Paul is showing to them a Roman soldier. A Jewish rabbi did show them a Roman warrior or soldier and explaining to them, see how he is dressed. He has this breastplate, this warrior, and he calls it the breastplate of righteousness. Two words that can easily be understood, but what do they mean for us? What is righteousness? This is a question. Righteousness. What do you understand? How do you understand the word righteousness for you or for yourself? To live righteously according to the commandments of God or to the law of God? Let us have a look at this passage that Adina was mentioning. We are looking in Deuteronomy chapter 6. Deuteronomy chapter 6 is well known. And why is that? Because in chapter 6, verse 4, we read, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, the Lord alone." And for the majority of you, these words are quite familiar, because this is the Shema, which is written down in chapter 6. We continue to read in verse 20, also well known. When your son asks you in time to come, saying, "What do the testimonies and the statutes and the judgments mean which the Lord our God commanded you?" then you shall say to your son. Does this remind you of something? What are you reminded of when you hear that? The Seder? Right. What are they to be told, the sons? We continue to read. Then you shall say to your son, "We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and the Lord brought us from Egypt with a mighty hand. Moreover, the Lord showed great and distressing signs and wonders before our eyes against Egypt, Pharaoh, and all his household. He brought us out from there in order to bring us in, to give us the land which he had sworn to our fathers." Everything fine. He brought his people out in order to give them the land. You could have made a full stop here, but there are two more verses following. So the Lord commanded us to observe all these statutes, to fear the Lord our God for our good always, and for our survival as it is today. It will be righteousness for us if we are careful to observe all this commandment before the Lord our God, just as he commanded us. Verse 24. In keeping these statutes, this is what our life depends on. Verse 25. The righteousness is in it when you are careful to observe all of these commandments. And here an interesting thing begins. How much do you have to be careful to observe in order to understand? Because this expression is quite flexible, to be careful to observe. If I would ask who is not interested or not careful in keeping the commandments, nobody would say yes, because we are all careful in doing so. I try to cross the street at the green traffic light. At least I am careful. So, but when you hear that I'm careful, how do you understand it? I try to start walking when it is a green sign. So I am careful walking when it's the green light. If your child is coming to you asking, Papa, Mama, I am careful not to go for a walk on the highway or on the street. So how do you react when your child is telling you that? Me and my friends, we are not trying to walk around on the highway. Of course, then you start questioning a little bit more. How much does your child care? How much is your child careful not to walk on the highway? Why are you interested in how much the child is careful? Because this would make you worry more than me being careful not or only walking when it's green, because it is more dangerous for your child. And we have just read that the life of the people of Israel depends on being careful to observe the statutes of God, where he says, I will keep if you keep my statutes and commandments. The righteousness was in being careful keeping the commandments, being careful, to be very much careful. We all are careful, but we do not succeed. Not only Israel did not succeed, all of us are not successful in doing so. What do we read about Israel, to whom this was given? So, when we read what Israel did care for, I also heard other opinions that all of those who did not belong to Israel, that they were still on the palm trees. This is how some people think. Please open Isaiah 59. Isaiah 59. We will begin reading in verse 1. Behold, the Lord's hand is not so short that it cannot save, nor is his ear so dull that it cannot hear. But your iniquities have made a separation between you and your God. And your sins have hidden his face from you, so that he does not hear. For your hands are defiled with blood, and your fingers with iniquity. Your lips have spoken falsehood, your tongue mutters wickedness. No one sues righteously and no one pleads honestly. They trust in confusion and speak lies. They conceive mischief and bring forth iniquity. They hatch adder's eggs and weave the spider's web. He who eats of their eggs dies, and from that which is crushed a snake breaks forth. Their webs will not become clothing, nor will they cover themselves with their works. Their works are works of iniquity, and an act of violence is in their hands. Their feet run to evil, and they hasten to shed innocent blood. Their thoughts are thoughts of iniquity. Devastation and destruction are in their highways. They do not know the way of peace, and there is no justice in their tracks. They have made their paths crooked. Whoever treads on them does not know peace. Therefore justice is far from us, and righteousness does not overtake us. We hope for light, but behold darkness, for brightness, but we walk in gloom. We grope along the wall like blind men. We grope like those who have no eyes. We stumble at midday as in the twilight. Among those who are vigorous, we are like dead men. All of us growl like bears and moan sadly like doves. We hope for justice, but there is none, for salvation, but it is far from us. What is written here is horrible, scary. Scary because the revelation that God had given, the first who had to experience this in his own life, what it means to be separated from God. And we have read, beginning in verse 1, that God is willing to hear and that He has the strength to help us. And He was ready to help the nation of Israel. But it was sin that made a separation. What we will continue to read reminds me of something. Verse 12. For our transgressions are multiplied before you, and your sins testify against us. For our transgressions are with us, and we know our iniquities. When I read this verse, you would like to do the following movement: beating your chest, beating your breast. When I read verse 13, I want to make this movement: transgressing and denying the Lord, and turning away from our God, speaking oppression and revolt, conceiving in and uttering from the heart lying words. When you read these words, you feel like being in the time of Yom Kippur. And there's also justice is turned back and righteousness stands far away. For truth has stumbled in the street, and uprightness cannot enter. Verse 14 was this. We continue to read, yet, yes, truth is lacking, and he who turns aside from evil makes himself a prey. Now the Lord saw, and it was displeasing in his sight that there was no justice. And he saw that there was no man, and was astonished that there was no one to intercede. Then his own arm brought salvation to him, and his righteousness upheld him. When we read the epistle to the Ephesians, we read about an example of a Roman soldier. The Apostle Paul, when he explained it to the Ephesians, he showed them a Roman warrior, Roman soldier. But what he is telling them, explaining to them, we find in this text. Verse 17, we are still in Isaiah. He put on righteousness like a breastplate, and the helmet of salvation on his head. And he put on garments of vengeance for clothing, and wrapped himself with zeal as a mantle. This is almost word by word what we read in Ephesians. Of course, Rabbi Paul, the Apostle Paul, who was writing to the Ephesians, he was using this passage when he spoke about righteousness to the Ephesians. He told them how they should live. When we read here about righteousness, we read how Israel did not live. And when we talk about righteousness, this is not just clothing, this is not a uniform, this is also not just a wording, this is life, it's talking about life. And all passages in the Bible speaking about righteousness, they speak about how you should live. And of course, when we walk along somewhere, we can see, oh, look, there's a righteous one. Probably because he is clothed accordingly. Maybe he is kind of sad, perhaps. But all the passages in the Bible speaking about righteousness, they speak about how we should live. Please open another passage, which is Romans chapter 3. We will begin reading in verse 19.
Праведность Божия через веру в Иешуа Мессию во всех и на всех верующих, ибо нет различия. Потому что все согрешили и лишены славы Божией, получая оправдание даром по благодати Его, искуплением Мессии Иешуа, которого Бог предложил в жертву умилостивления в крови Его через веру, для показания праведности Его в прощении грехов, соделанных прежде. Во время долготерпения Божия, показанию праведности Его в настоящее время, да явится Он оправданным, праведным и оправдывающим верующего в Иешуа.
Beginning in verse 19, for we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be closed and all the world may become accountable to God. Because by the works of the law, no flesh will be justified in his sight, for through the law comes the knowledge of sin. But now apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been manifested, being witnessed by the law and the prophets, even the righteousness of God through faith in Yeshua the Messiah for all those who believe, for there is no distinction, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, being justified as a gift by his grace through the redemption which is in Messiah Yeshua, whom God displayed publicly as a propitiation in his blood through faith. This was to demonstrate his righteousness, because in the forbearance of God he passed over the sins previously committed. For the demonstration, I say, of his righteousness at the present time, so that he would be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Yeshua. In verse 20, an interesting thing is described, because by the works of the law no flesh will be justified in his sight. Through the works of the law no flesh will be justified. But if we will not become righteous through the works of the law, why should we then keep them? What do you think? If by these works we will not be justified, why should we fulfill them? Please explain it to me. So that you have the understanding or the knowledge that you are a sinner, that you will not get into jail, into prison, in order to love him, but not in order to be justified or becoming righteous, in order to honor God with our life. You have to be righteous and believe in order to please him. So everything just separately, works or faith, does not work. It has to be together. Well, all of you are right. Everyone has her understanding of it. I have heard another explanation, quite simple explanation, which I liked very much. God said it to his people, and this was interesting. This thought I heard from a Jew believing in Yeshua. I don't know his name. I was just standing next to when I heard a conversation, and he was asked, "How did you come to faith in Yeshua?" He was raised as an Orthodox, and when he read in the scriptures that the Lord commanded to believe in Yeshua, to believe in the Messiah, who is Yeshua, and then he said, when I understood that this is a command of God, then I did believe in him and I turned to him. So it is quite a short and simple explanation, but for me it is a good and a right explanation. For the people of Israel, or for the nation of Israel, there is no other way out. When they moved out of Egypt, when they came to the mountain, what did they say? Everything that God will command us, we will do, we will fulfill. For the nation of Israel, this is not the question whether to fulfill or not to fulfill. If you want to live like as we have read today in Deuteronomy, if you want to live, do you want to live? Then you have to live that way. Believe in Yeshua, and with all of your strength, all of your might, trying to live according to the Torah in order to live. But we live in such a world where are so many wonderful things around us, and Paul did understand that. When he said to the Ephesians that they have to be ready, being equipped against the wiles of the devil, then he knew and understood that they were living in a world where they are surrounded, always surrounded by this. But yeah, you want to live like others as well. You don't want to be the white crow. Among all the other blacks. You would like to be like all the others, to believe in God and be like all the others in order that no one will pointing finger at you. Once I was in a situation approximately 1 year ago, whether I wanted it or not, but I was sticking out. It was a funeral. It was at a funeral, and it was a large funeral. You came dressed like you should, and it was in a church. I was at funerals in Russia and in the Ukraine. I haven't been for a long time at a funeral in Germany. Maybe I never was part of a German funeral, but I was at some others, so I arrived. We arrived early. The church was still quite empty, and we were waiting till everything would begin. And when people were slowly arriving, especially the men, then I understood that in the Russian culture, and that there is a difference between the German culture and the Russian culture, how to appear at a funeral. Some people were already looking at me, so there were other people who did not have the same experience. So you cannot imagine coming to a funeral with a white shirt. And yes, I came with a dark shirt. In the church there were around 300-400 people, and you are the only one wearing a black shirt, and all the others had a white shirt. If I had been with a white shirt, nobody would remember me. But I was in a black shirt, and I was there till the end. And I believe if you had asked the people a couple of days later, if you had asked them, do you remember Andrei? who is Andrei? They would have said, well, the one in the black shirt. Oh, yes, I remember. So for a long time, I had not left such an impression that 300-400 people would remember me. So this is not how you want to be exposed or stick out. At that moment, I dearly wanted to go and buy me a white shirt, but it was just a small village, so there was nothing around. But I so much wanted to be like all the others. So how much known is this feeling? Do we live like all the others, and do we not stick out? But here the question is, do you want to live? Do you want to live? Or is it that you just don't want to stick out? What God had told to his people was, do you want to live? I will give you this life. Be obedient to my words. Believe in Yeshua, and I will give you this life. To the believers, he says, you cannot escape the situation that Satan will come. He will come. And you will have these moments in life where you will need God's help. And this help will come when you live righteously. Do not ask me how this is connected, one with the other. I know another nice passage that helps me a bit. Open Proverbs 17. Proverbs 16. Chapter 16, verse 7. When a man's ways are pleasing to the Lord, he makes even his enemies to be at peace with him. When a man's ways are pleasing to the Lord, the Lord makes even his enemies to be at peace with him. So it doesn't matter which bus you are taking, but how you live. God is looking at how you live, and when it is pleasing to him, he will help you. He will fight for you. He will intercede for you. He will make your enemies to be at peace with you. Try for yourself to do that. The person or the people you are in trouble with or in quarrel with, try to make them to speak nicely to you, but he will do it for you. But he says that our life, how we live, decides whether he will do it or not. I would make a stop here. And as for Ephesians, I would tell you, we are not the Ephesians. There are Jews and non-Jews, believers and non-believers.